Every year, hundreds of murder cases go cold. This Snap special episode takes a look at 2 cold cases that went unsolved for decades.
They have to have hard evidence, and they didn't have any.
Carolyn McCaleb said an intruder killed her husband.
She heard the gun go off.
Elizabeth Ortiz's husband fell mysteriously ill at work.
And then he went into a coma.
2 different crimes, 2 different investigations, but with one thing in common.
Time does not do a murder investigation good.
And as the police search for evidence,
We got nothing, no leads.
and suspects disappear,
We just knew she was gone.
hear the family's frustration firsthand,
It was awful. Nothing seemed to ever change.
and find out what happens when a case of cold-blooded murder just goes cold.
She thought she was going to get away with it, and she almost did.
Houston, Texas, September 22nd, 1985. It was around 11 o'clock that Sunday evening when the Houston police received a distraught call from 43-year-old Carolyn McCaleb.
She told police that she'd been raped.
However, as Carolyn told the dispatcher, that wasn't all her attacker had done.
He shot and killed her husband.
The Houston PD rushed to the scene, where they found 51-year-old Roy McCaleb lying in bed with a gunshot wound to the head.
He suffered 1 gunshot wound to the back of the right ear.
EMTs did transport Roy to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead upon arrival. And in the meantime, crime scene tape went up while Carolyn told the police what happened.
That a man had come into her house with a knife, raped her, and then used a gun to shoot her husband.
She gave a generic description: white male, long black hair.
Soon after, Roy's family began to arrive at the scene.
There's detectives and police officers all over the place going in and out.
But if Roy's family wanted answers, they would have to wait.
They had Carol in the back talking to her.
We didn't know what happened.
But as it turned out, their wait outside the house that night would be nothing compared to how long it would take for the truth to finally be revealed. Carolyn was 38 when she met Roy in 1979 while working for a construction company connected to Houston's booming oil industry.
They built offshore drilling rigs. He was a foreman in the rigging department.
Carolyn worked in the office,
She worked in the human resource department.
which was kind of odd considering that Carolyn wasn't much of a people person.
She was standoffish. She wasn't outgoing at all.
Roy, on the other hand,
My daddy was very outgoing. He was the life of the party. He loved to sing and tell jokes.
however, there was something that Carolyn and Roy had in common: divorce. By the time she met Roy, Carolyn had several failed marriages behind her and 2 grown sons.
One of them was a Houston police officer.
Roy was recently divorced too, from his first wife.
My mom and daddy were married 23 years.
And his children were grown too, leaving Roy on his own.
He was lonely, and he needed somebody.
Which was where Carolyn came in.
He told me he met somebody and that she was a very nice lady.
Roy's children found the standoffish Carolyn tough to get to know.
She didn't talk much to us or anything. She was just always kind of quiet.
But Roy was clearly in love. So when he and Carolyn got married in January of 1984, his daughters were willing to accept their new stepmother.
I thought if she makes him happy, that's what matters.
But the newlyweds would find their happiness cut short. In 1985, just a year after the wedding, Roy was badly injured in a work accident.
He was knocked off of a barge by a crane and he fell into the bayou and he hurt his back.
With Carolyn's help, he recovered from his accident and the resulting back surgery. But he was still on pain medication 2 months later, on the evening of September 22nd, when someone stepped up to his bedside and put a gun to his head. When the Houston police arrived at the scene, they found Carolyn waiting with her 20-year-old son, who was living temporarily with his mother and Roy while training to be a police officer like his older brother.
Her son was going to the police academy at the time.
However, while he had apparently been home when the shooting occurred, all the officer in training knew was what his mother told him.
That somebody broke in the house and raped Carol and shot my daddy, and he was dead.
Carolyn told the police that since Roy was still recovering from his back surgery, they'd been sleeping in separate bedrooms.
She was in the bedroom next to my daddy.
And at around 10 o'clock, not long after she'd gone to bed.
She was reading a book and her door opened.
According to Carolyn, when she looked up, a man with a knife stood in her bedroom door. Carolyn said she'd been too frightened to cry out, even when the man came into the room and got in bed with her.
She said that he had held a knife to her throat.
In fact, Carolyn said she'd been too terrified to even reach for the .38 caliber revolver she'd brought to bed for protection.
The gun was lying on the bed with her. The suspect saw it and told her to hand it over to him, which she did.
And then, according to Carolyn, the now well-armed intruder proceeded to sexually assault her.
He does some bizarre things. He pulled out his knife and stroked her with the knife.
Then something even stranger happened.
Somebody knocked on her door.
It was Carolyn's son and his girlfriend.
He was just telling her that he's going to walk his girlfriend out to her car. She was leaving.
According to Carolyn, the intruder told her to get rid of them, or else.
He'd kill everybody in the house. She opened the door and had a conversation with her son, with the guy in the room.
Tries to talk him into following a girlfriend home.
And when the son said no, he was just going to walk his girlfriend to her car.
She told her bye.
According to Carolyn, when her son left to walk his girlfriend out, the intruder had dragged her back into the bedroom, waited for her son to go to bed, and then...
He continues the sexual assault.
He was supposedly there between 45 minutes to an hour.
But when her attacker left, the nightmare wasn't over. Because according to Carolyn, he'd taken her gun with him and apparently slipped into the next room where Roy lay sleeping.
He'd taken some pills for his pain. So he's probably pretty well out of it.
So much so that he never knew what happened next. Carolyn said the gunshot had caught her by surprise.
She heard the gun go off, and she jumped up, and she ran in the hallway, and the guy was running out of my daddy's room, and they bumped into each other.
According to Carolyn, that's when the intruder had dropped the gun.
He takes off out of the house.
And Carolyn said she'd snatched up the gun and set off in pursuit.
She runs out the back door and claims she took a couple of shots at the suspect.
The sound of the gunshots had brought her son running out of his bedroom. And when Carolyn told him about the intruder,
the son reloads the gun and he goes out looking for the suspect.
Meanwhile, Carolyn said she had gone into her husband's bedroom.
Been found that he'd been shot.
He was asleep when he got killed.
It was an incredible story, literally.
The police thought that this story didn't really hold together.
For one thing, there was the pistol supposedly beside her on the bed when she first saw the intruder.
She has a gun. That's been the first thing I would have grabbed as soon as I saw him, but she didn't.
Instead, she waited until the killer was fleeing to use her gun. A story that conveniently explained any gunshot residue on her hands.
Carol claimed that she picked up the gun and fired 2 shots.
But for the investigators, the most incredible thing about Carolyn's story was that she had seen the intruder before. Coming up, the killer's trail goes cold.
They have to have hard evidence, and they didn't have any.
And later, a medical mystery goes unsolved.
Gilbert's system shut down, his liver failed.
On the night of September 22nd, 1985, 43-year-old Carolyn McCaleb called 911 and reported that her husband Roy had just been shot and killed in cold blood.
He had just had major surgery. He was probably really deep sleep when this happened.
According to what she told the police, an intruder had killed Roy, using the gun Carolyn kept for protection.
Supposedly, this guy broke in the house and did this.
However, that wasn't the only strange story Carolyn told the investigators.
A week earlier, the same man had raped her.
According to the 43-year-old, it had happened as she was driving to work on the morning of September 12th.
She stopped at a stop sign, and all of a sudden her car door opened, and it was a guy with a knife.
This same suspect got into her car and forced her to go to a secluded area where he sexually assaulted her.
She said that afterwards, her attacker had simply left.
She said that she drove home, cleaned herself up, and went on to work.
Without reporting the rape.
She never called the police because Mr. McCaleb, her husband, had a heart condition and he didn't want to get him angry and have him have a heart attack.
That's what Carolyn claimed, but the investigators found it hard to believe.
The whole idea that someone would carjack you and rape you and then somehow find you at your house a week later, it just didn't make a lot of sense to police.
How did he know where she lived?
And even if he could have learned her address, how did he get into the house?
There's no forced entry in any of the doors. There was no forced entry in any of the windows.
Finally, there was Carolyn's bizarre claim that in the middle of the intruder's alleged sexual assault, she'd stepped out to speak with her son while the intruder waited.
It's kind of odd that he would allow her to go out in the hallway to communicate with her son.
So, skeptical of her story, the investigators asked if she would agree to take a polygraph test.
It's a tool that the investigators have, and they offered it to her and she said that she would do it.
But 3 weeks after the murder, on October 11th, when she was supposed to show up at headquarters for the test,
the investigators get a call from her lawyer saying, hey, she's not coming down. Just doesn't make sense. We're trying to find out who killed your husband, and you start putting up walls to prevent us from doing our job.
However, there was one scenario where Carolyn's refusal to take a polygraph made perfect sense.
This woman had shot her husband.
Carolyn refusing to take the polygraph had catapulted her to the top of the suspect list. But why would she kill her husband of less than 2 years? Questioning Roy's family produced a possible answer.
My daddy and her had made a will, and he left everything to her.
His savings, the house, and his insurance.
There was a total of 2 insurance policies.
The payoff wasn't much, only around $50,000. But for the investigators, it added up to a motive.
And the detectives started calling, actually telling us that we know she did it.
However, if Roy's family expected an arrest, they would be disappointed.
They have to have hard evidence, and they didn't have any.
Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, as the family's frustration mounted.
We were told that maybe if we don't do anything now, later on, another clue will come out.
Things like this takes time. Somebody knows something.
Or did somebody know someone? As years passed and the investigation stalled, Roy's family couldn't help getting a little suspicious.
I started thinking, well, maybe because her son's a Houston police officer, her other son's in the academy.
The case might not have stunk, but it smelled a little bit off.
You know, it makes you wonder.
Whatever the reason, after 8 years, one thing was clear to Roy's family, that the case had gone cold.
It was awful. And nothing seemed to ever change.
The McCalebs are very distraught that this nothing ever resulted from this investigation.
Then, in 1993, despite having been a suspect in her husband's unsolved murder, Carolyn got a civilian job with the Houston police.
It looked like something had been swept under the rug.
Carolyn spent 11 years with the Houston PD, working as a clerk in the department's finance office. And in 2007, 3 years after she left the department, the cold case squad reopened the investigation into Roy's murder.
Like a lot of cold cases, this was pushed forward by the family. The daughter, she called and called and called HPD and the DA's office.
I would call and I would ask, is there anything new?
She stayed after it. She didn't let the police quit.
But after more than 20 years, would it be too late?
The more time goes on, the more it helps a suspect. Cops retire. The file just collects dust.
Carolyn had certainly moved on. Now in her late 60s, she was Carolyn Krazan Wilson after another marriage and another divorce.
She'd been married 7 times.
When the cold case investigators dug into the file, one thing quickly became clear. The case going cold had nothing to do with Carolyn's sons in law enforcement.
They were loyal to their mom, as good sons were, but I don't think they did anything to hinder the murder investigation.
Unfortunately for Roy's family, that was about the only new information that the cold case investigation revealed.
All the evidence and all the witnesses would still be the same.
But while that hadn't been enough for an arrest back in 1985, was that still the case some 23 years later?
The clock was ticking.
And with Carolyn now 65 years old and diagnosed with Alzheimer's, how much longer could the police and prosecutors afford to wait for a break in the case?
There was a good chance that if Carolyn Krazan Wilson died, that all these secrets would have just gone to the grave.
So figuring they had nothing to lose and hoping that an arrest might provide the break they'd waited so long for, the investigators drove out to her home in the Houston suburbs on July 8th, 2008.
Me and another guy went out there, knocked on the door, took her into custody.
She was very shocked. After all these years, they come knocking on her door.
So shocked that as they made the hour-long drive to police headquarters on the other side of the sprawling city, Carolyn completely fell apart.
She was upset, emotionally distraught when we collected her. She went into the fetal position and she just howled the whole time.
But while the police had finally made an arrest in the decades-old case, getting to trial wouldn't be straightforward. First, there were years of legal wrangling over her indictment, and then there was the issue of her age.
Juries are a little reluctant to convict little old ladies for murder.
So when Carolyn's attorney started making inquiries about a plea bargain, the district attorney was receptive.
The DA approached us, said, hey, they're offering a deal. And he told us that he was going to leave it up to us.
Under the terms of the proposed deal, Carolyn would plead guilty and serve only 6 months in prison, followed by 10 years probation.
I thought that was about as good a result as we could hope for.
She got essentially a really, really good deal.
It was too good a deal for Roy McCaleb's family.
We're like, oh, no, hell no. We're going to trial.
But then, as defense motions kept delaying the trial and Carolyn entered her 70s, the family reconsidered, worried that justice could slip away a second time.
We thought, at any minute she could die.
On October 23, 2013, Carolyn pled guilty to the murder of Roy McCaleb, and the 71-year-old was sentenced to a mere 6 months in prison.
We weren't happy with it, not at all, but we were satisfied that at least she got up there and she said, I'm guilty.
That's the only satisfaction basically we got out of it.
And since Carolyn offered no explanation, they could only guess at why she killed Roy 28 years earlier.
If he stays alive, she has to take care of him. If he's dead, she doesn't have to take care of him, and she gets a substantial sum of money.
After decades of watching Carolyn go on with her life in the very same town, Roy McCaleb's family finally had an admission of her guilt. But for another family, finding the woman they suspected of murder would become an international affair. Coming up, a man is struck down by a mysterious illness.
He went into a coma.
And his wife holds the key to the puzzle.
She kept saying, this is what he took.
Our next cold case takes us to Redwood City, California. It was early Wednesday afternoon on March 11, 1992, when 23-year-old Gilbert Ortiz took his lunch break.
Gilbert was working at Toys R Us, a local toy store here in Redwood City.
Lunch was nothing fancy, a burger and fries and a homemade protein shake.
It was a protein shake and would, help him build his muscle mass.
But he'd only been in the store's break room a few minutes when something went horribly wrong.
He was extremely sick. He vomited, he went into the bathroom, passed out.
One of the employees in the break room with him went and got help for him, and they called paramedics.
By the time the ambulance arrived, Gilbert had regained consciousness. Barely.
He was in and out. His eyes kept rolling back. And it was just really bad.
Suspecting food poisoning, the paramedics asked Gilbert about the shake he'd had with lunch.
The paramedics said, "Who gave you this? What's in this?" And he said, "A friend." When they transported him, they transported that container up with him.
However, once the paramedics rushed Gilbert to the ER, the doctors suspected they were dealing with something far more serious than food poisoning.
They thought it might be some sort of a drug overdose.
But when Gilbert's wife, 22-year-old Elizabeth Ortiz, hurried to the hospital to be with her ailing husband, she assured the doctors that it wasn't an overdose.
She just kept saying, no, he doesn't do any drugs. But the doctor was like, the way he is, this is not food poisoning. This is something else.
Whatever was wrong with Gilbert, it was deadly serious.
Gilbert's systems shut down, his liver failed.
And then he went into a coma.
And if the doctors didn't figure something out fast, it looked as if his young wife might soon be a widow. Although born in the U.S. in 1969, Elizabeth had spent much of her childhood with her family in Mexico.
She went back to Mexico and grew up there. And then she came back to the United States.
Back in the U.S., the 18-year-old took a clerical job in the San Francisco area, and not long after, she met Gilbert. Born in Nicaragua in 1968, Gilbert and his family had left their war-torn country when he was in his early teens.
We came to the United States in 1983.
After high school, Gilbert served a short stint in the U.S. Army and was working at an auto body shop when he met Elizabeth in 1987.
He met her at a club.
And while Gilbert wasn't exactly the sort of guy most women swooned over,
Gilbert was a really slight man, a little bit thin.
Elizabeth clearly saw something in him.
He was a nice guy.
And then, after 3 years of dating,
Elizabeth became pregnant.
Naturally, nice guy Gilbert asked Elizabeth to marry him.
They did make the decision to get married.
And when their son was born in 1990, he tried hard to be a good father.
He wasn't just a dad that came home and worked and ate dinner and went to sleep. He took care of him. He changed his diaper, he fed him, he bathed him, he did everything.
He even took on a second job.
That's when he started working at Toys R Us.
And now, after falling mysteriously ill in the break room at work, Gilbert was fighting for his life as his wife of 3 years watched helplessly. By March 17, 1992, Gilbert had been in the hospital for 6 days. And while he was still alive, the 23-year-old wasn't out of danger by any means.
Gilbert's in a coma for 10 days. His kidney and liver failed. He was in intensive care.
And since the doctors still weren't sure exactly what was wrong with Gilbert, his illness remained a medical mystery.
Initially, the police were not involved at all.
But that was all about to change. That afternoon, after 6 anxious days at her husband's bedside, Elizabeth told Gilbert's sister that she was going to try and get to the bottom of his strange illness.
She came to me and said, I'm going to go to his work and go through his locker and see what I can find.
However, she never made it to Toys R Us. Just a few minutes after she left the ICU waiting room, Elizabeth came running back inside.
She was hysterical. She came crying and yelling, and the nurses were, calm down, tell us what happened. And she kept saying, this is what he took.
And then Elizabeth handed the nurse a brown paper bag.
The nurse then, opens the bag and pulls out a bottle of insecticide.
The nurse immediately called poison control.
And then she called the Redwood City Police Department.
Questioned by Detective Anderson, Elizabeth explained how she'd gotten the insecticide.
She gave a story about a masked man giving her this bottle of insecticide.
According to Elizabeth, he'd been waiting for her in the hospital parking lot.
This man handed it to her and told her that Gilbert had drank the contents of what was in this bag.
Although according to what the masked man supposedly told Elizabeth, the poisoning was an accident.
The man said it wasn't meant for him.
She said that the man also threatened that if she went to the police, he would kill her son.
But when the police began pressing her for more details about the masked man,
she began to crumble and said, okay, I made that part up.
And according to Elizabeth, she'd made it up to hide the real reason her husband had ended up in the hospital.
It was a suicide attempt.
At least that's what Elizabeth said she believed, based on two things, starting with something Gilbert's doctor had supposedly said.
She told us that the doctor told her that what he drank was insecticide.
As a result, Elizabeth said she had spent the evening ransacking their house.
I knew that I had to find it, and I did.
Once again, the police were dubious, both about the suicide story.
It just doesn't add up.
And Elizabeth's reason for trying to cover it up.
She says, well, I thought that maybe he didn't want me to know.
However, despite the fact that she was obviously lying to them,
at this point, we truly don't have enough to hold her. Her story is strange, but we don't have enough to connect her to how he becomes poisoned.
To bolster their suspicions, the investigators followed up with Gilbert's friends and family to get a sense of the couple's relationship. And what they learned was eye-opening.
There was some tension in the marriage.
She would try to control him.
People would describe Elizabeth as being the one fully wearing the pants in the relationship.
But it didn't quite add up to a motive for attempted murder.
It wasn't like a big fight or anything like that.
However, when the investigators followed up with Gilbert's doctors, they did discover something disturbing. The doctors never told Elizabeth anything about insecticide.
At that point, the doctors had no idea what he had consumed.
So how had Elizabeth known that insecticide was the source of Gilbert's poisoning? When the investigators asked about the empty milkshake container that the paramedics had brought to the hospital, hoping to check it for fingerprints, they made another surprising discovery.
It went missing during the time frame that his wife, Elizabeth, was in the room with him.
But while that was certainly enough to raise suspicion on the part of the investigators, it wasn't quite enough to convince a prosecutor to file charges.
That always requires two things. Number one, is there evidence to crime? And number two, can we prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she is the person who did it?
However, while the investigators didn't have enough for an arrest warrant, there was something they could do.
I decided that I needed to protect Gilbert. I filled out the paperwork which would prevent her from being able to visit him, because I now believe that she could harm him further.
Meaning that when Elizabeth went to the hospital to visit her husband,
the nurse came because she wasn't allowed to be near him.
That was only a temporary fix, though. One to keep Gilbert safe while the investigators prepared another important piece of paperwork, a search warrant.
We need to get in the house and see if there's anything that will show evidence of her having concocted this milkshake.
However, on March 20th, when the investigators knocked on Elizabeth's door to serve the search warrant,
she's nowhere to be found.
All of her stuff was gone. Clothes, all the items for the baby, everything was gone.
Elizabeth had taken her 2-year-old son and vanished. Coming up, dramatic new evidence ties Elizabeth directly to the poisoning.
Now we've got a case.
But will the authorities find Elizabeth before her trail goes cold?
When suspects go to Mexico, you don't hear of them ever again.
By March 20th, 1992, it had been 9 days since Gilbert Ortiz had been rushed to a Redwood City, California hospital, the victim of a cold and calculated crime.
His organs began to fail one by one. He went into a coma.
He'd become horribly ill after drinking a protein shake during his lunch break at work.
His coworkers, they called 911.
And by the 20th, the police were convinced that Gilbert's wife, 22-year-old Elizabeth Ortiz, had somehow poisoned her husband.
Who's always the most logical suspect? The person closest to them.
The investigators had gotten a restraining order, keeping Elizabeth out of Gilbert's hospital room, and a search warrant for their home. But when they served the warrant, they discovered that Elizabeth had taken the couple's 2-year-old son and disappeared.
When she found that we had prevented her from going to even visit Gilbert, she then gets his paycheck, and then she's gone.
It was just like, where is she? I mean, we can't find her. We just knew she was gone, but we didn't know where.
Elizabeth may have been gone, but Gilbert was still clinging to life. And 10 days after he had been poisoned, the investigators received word from the hospital. Gilbert had just come out of his coma. Incredibly, the key to Gilbert's recovery was when Elizabeth had come forward with the insecticide.
They were actually able to reverse some of the effects because they didn't know how to treat it until they got the information from poison control.
Although when the investigators sat down with Gilbert to take his statement, it was obvious that he was still in bad shape.
What would you like to know? What would I like to know?
He was in a lot of pain, but he was willing and answered my questions.
In his statement, Gilbert revealed that what the investigators suspected was correct. Elizabeth was the source of the insecticide-laden shake.
She came doctor. It's supposed to be amino acids. Amino acids. Supposed to.
She told him that would help him to become more muscular.
Gilbert tells me that his wife really liked men who are buff and strong, and he had tried everything to try and get bigger, but he couldn't get bigger.
So why had he told the paramedics that a friend had given him the shake? According to Gilbert, he'd merely been repeating what Elizabeth told him.
Elizabeth tells him that she knew this guy that was super buffed and muscular, and he mixed up the milkshake.
And thinking the shake would help him bulk up, Gilbert said he unwittingly drank the poison.
What did it taste like?
Nasty.
Can you describe it at all?
It's like sour, it's like spicy stuff.
Did it burn your mouth?
Yes, it did, a lot.
With Gilbert's statement on the record, the authorities finally had enough to arrest Elizabeth.
Now we've got a case.
The question was, could they find her?
She was hiding.
Her mother and other family members shrugged their shoulders, had no idea where she was.
And the investigators had a pretty good idea where.
She did have extended family that lived in Mexico.
But when the Redwood City Police requested help from the FBI and the Mexican authorities,
we got nothing. No leads, no feedback.
Despite the lack of progress, Gilbert's family never gave up hope.
I just knew someday she was going to be found. She's not a career criminal. This is just a woman with a child.
By then, Gilbert had been released from the hospital and started on the slow, agonizing road to recovery.
Gilbert was having all kinds of physical problems and issues.
His legs were in so much pain that he couldn't walk. He crawled for several months.
And then there was the psychological damage.
Every time we would bring him food, whether it was my mom or myself, he would make us eat it before he would.
Meanwhile, the hunt for Elizabeth continued.
We really had no location within Mexico for them to pinpoint. We had, certain areas and certain towns that she may have family in, but it really wasn't enough.
And all the while, Elizabeth's trail grew colder as months passed, and then years.
Oftentimes, suspects go to Mexico. You don't hear of them ever again.
And for Gilbert, every year Elizabeth spent on the run was another year he spent without his son.
That was a fear that really permeated in his life, that he might never see his child again.
But then, in March of 2000, 8 years after Elizabeth's husband first fell ill,
The FBI fugitive squad in Mexico told me that they thought they may know where she was.
Mexican authorities had located Elizabeth, now 30, living in Guadalajara.
She had assumed another identity.
They were incredibly lucky to find her.
And the next day, the Redwood City Police received another call. Elizabeth had been taken into custody.
I was just elated.
But then,
when I asked about the little boy, where's the little boy, his response was, what little boy?
The Mexican authorities had picked up Elizabeth, but not her son, now 10 years old.
This little boy is who knows where. We need to find him for nothing else other than to protect him and make sure he's okay.
Desperate to get the boy back to his father and hoping he was still with Elizabeth's extended family, the investigators asked the guards at the San Mateo County Jail to be on the lookout when Elizabeth was extradited back to California.
Maybe this prisoner, Elizabeth, would get a visit from a young child.
And the hunch paid off.
One night I got a phone call from a very astute deputy.
Elizabeth's mother had come to visit her in jail, accompanied by a little boy.
At one point, the little boy and Elizabeth both put their hands on the glass on either side of the glass and were touching through the glass, and both of them were crying.
Minutes later, as Elizabeth's mother and son left the jail, the police took the little boy into custody and reunited him with his father.
We saw him and he hugged his dad. And he told them, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "Yes, you're my dad."
It was just so exciting to think that they would have a second chance.
But would he ever see his mother outside a prison cell? Elizabeth Ortiz stood trial for attempted murder in January of 2002 after an almost 2-year scramble by the prosecutors to reassemble the decade-old case.
So, time doesn't stand still. People get married, they move away. I don't know how many officers had come and gone.
However, no one had forgotten about the crime. Most of all, Gilbert, who opened the prosecution's case by testifying to the lasting damage he'd suffered from the attempt on his life.
He was still suffering from nerve damage. He had a little bit of numbness in his fingers still.
And that wasn't the only lasting damage to his nerves either. On the stand, Gilbert's psychological scars were plain to see.
He was very frightened, literally shaking, going into testifying.
But while the damage Elizabeth had caused was obvious, the prosecutors were hard-pressed to explain just why she had poisoned him.
We weren't able to give the jury a clear answer.
The state painted it as a woman who was frustrated with her lot in life and was really, really angry.
But while the prosecution was struggling to find a motive, the defense would have an explanation for what she'd done. Coming up, Elizabeth takes the stand and makes a startling accusation.
We were all surprised.
Would the jury see a cold-blooded killer or a desperate victim?
She had no other choice.
In January of 2002, almost 10 years after her husband had mysteriously fallen ill, 32-year-old Elizabeth Ortiz stood trial for attempted murder.
She did everything within her power to end his life.
And when the defense presented its case, they didn't deny that Elizabeth had poisoned her husband, but they also pointed out that she had provided the information that saved his life.
He continued to get worse and worse until she brought in the insecticide.
And they claimed she'd had a compelling reason to poison her husband in the first place.
They painted it as an abusive relationship.
We were all equally surprised, when she took the position that she had been a battered woman.
Surprise or not, according to the defense, that was why she'd given Gilbert an insecticide-laced protein shake.
She allegedly was trying to escape. She had no other choice.
Although when Elizabeth took the stand in her own defense, she claimed that the sheikh was only supposed to make her husband sick.
Elizabeth hadn't been intending to kill him, but just wanted to incapacitate him to create this small window of time where she could take her child and go.
That was Elizabeth's version. But on cross, the prosecution pointed out that she hadn't immediately taken the child and run.
Once the police department started to focus their attention on Elizabeth, she disappeared.
But would the jurors be willing to overlook that discrepancy in the timing? On February 4th, 2002, they reached a verdict.
She was convicted of attempted murder.
The judge gave Elizabeth the maximum sentence for attempted murder, 13 years to life in prison. And while that was no guarantee she'd spend the rest of her life behind bars.
In California with a life sentence, defendants are eligible for parole after 7 years.
Gilbert and his family were grateful that Elizabeth had finally been brought to justice.
She thought she was going to get away with it. And she almost did.
Whether it takes 8 years like Elizabeth, or more than 20, as in the case of Carolyn McCaleb, when a murder case goes cold, the quest for justice becomes more difficult.
Time does not do a murder investigation good.
Evidence can be compromised.
A lot of times it's been lost, it's been improperly stored, where you can't do anything with it.
Testimony can be tainted.
Witnesses might recant statements people may not remember as much as they did.
But if there's anything that successful cold cases like the ones against Elizabeth Ortiz and Carolyn McCaleb have in common, it's victims, family, and investigators who never gave up.
We want that message to be out there to anybody who thinks about committing crimes, that we don't forget. We'll be there.
In South Los Angeles, there are stretches of road where thousands of people pass every day without ever wondering who walked there before them. The sidewalks along Figueroa Street have witnessed countless ordinary mornings and countless forgotten nights. Cars move through intersections. Buses stop to collect passengers. Neon signs flicker above aging storefronts, and life continues with remarkable indifference. Yet during the late 1980s and throughout much of the 1990s, those same streets quietly became the backdrop for one of the longest-running series of murders in Los Angeles history. The victims did not come from positions of wealth or influence. Most were women already struggling against circumstances that had pushed them to the margins of society. Some were homeless, some battled addiction, some survived through sex work. Many had become nearly invisible long before they disappeared. For years, their deaths appeared to investigators as isolated tragedies scattered across a city overwhelmed by violence. But hidden beneath those seemingly disconnected crimes was a single thread, one that would remain invisible until science finally caught up with the evidence left behind. The man responsible was Chester Dwayne Turner. Today, Turner stands convicted of 14 murders committed between 1987 and 1998. Prosecutors have long believed the true number of his victims may be even higher. His crimes unfolded over more than 11 years, making him one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in Los Angeles history. Yet what makes this case remarkable is not only the number of victims or the length of the killing spree. It is the unsettling fact that Turner was never identified through dramatic eyewitness testimony, elaborate undercover operations, or a sudden confession. Instead, his name emerged years later because microscopic biological evidence, carefully preserved from forgotten crime scenes, finally found its voice through advances in DNA technology. This is not simply the story of a serial killer. It is the story of a city of overlooked victims, of investigative limitations, and of justice delayed for more than a decade. To understand how Chester Turner remained unidentified for so long, We have to begin long before his arrest. We have to step back into an era when South Los Angeles faced challenges unlike any in its modern history. During the late 1980s, the city was under immense pressure. The crack cocaine epidemic had reshaped entire neighborhoods. Drug addiction spread rapidly through vulnerable communities. Street prostitution increased in areas where poverty and addiction fed one another in a relentless cycle. Violent crime rates remained extraordinarily high, stretching law enforcement resources thin. Detectives often found themselves working multiple homicide investigations simultaneously, each demanding immediate attention. Against that backdrop, the disappearance of women living unstable lives rarely generated widespread headlines. Many victims had no permanent address. Some had become estranged from their families. Others disappeared into environments where people came and went without anyone noticing for days or even weeks. This harsh reality did not diminish their value as human beings, but it profoundly affected how quickly their disappearances were recognized and investigated. Chester Turner understood this environment because he lived within it. Born on November 5, 1966 in Warren, Arkansas, Turner experienced an unstable childhood marked by his parents' divorce. Eventually, he moved with his mother to Los Angeles, where he spent much of his youth. His education ended early after dropping out of high school. Employment came only in brief periods. He worked various temporary jobs, including delivering pizza, but struggled to maintain steady work. Over time, he accumulated arrests involving theft, drug offenses, and violence. At different points, he stayed in homeless shelters and remained closely connected to neighborhoods where addiction, homelessness, and prostitution were part of everyday life. These are established facts documented after his arrest. They help explain where Turner lived and moved, but they do not explain why he became a murderer. No single event in his childhood or adult life provides a complete answer, and responsible reporting avoids suggesting that it does. What investigators eventually discovered was far simpler and far more disturbing. Turner repeatedly targeted women who were especially vulnerable because he understood that society often overlooked them. The pattern would not become obvious immediately. It emerged slowly, one victim at a time. The first confirmed murder attributed to Turner occurred in March 1987. The victim was 21-year-old Anita Fishman Breyer. Her body was discovered near Harbor Freeway. The forensic examination revealed evidence of sexual assault, and she had died from strangulation. Her body had been left outdoors. At the time, investigators processed the scene according to the forensic standards available in the late 1980s. Biological evidence was collected and preserved, but the technology capable of identifying an unknown offender from that evidence did not yet exist in a practical investigative sense. Detectives were left with fragments of information, but no identifiable suspect. They could document what had happened. They simply could not identify who had done it. As months turned into years, additional women were found under circumstances that increasingly resembled one another. Bodies appeared in vacant lots, alleys, or abandoned areas. Many victims had suffered sexual assaults. Many had died from manual or ligature strangulation. Some bodies showed signs of having been moved after death. Property theft did not appear to be the primary motive. Still, similarities alone could not solve the crimes. South Los Angeles was confronting numerous violent offenders during this period. Detectives investigating one homicide often had little reason to assume it belonged to the same offender responsible for another case several miles away. Some murders that appeared related were eventually determined to have been committed by entirely different individuals. This overlapping violence complicated every aspect of the investigation. As more victims were discovered, law enforcement began using the term Southside Slayer to describe what appeared to be a serial predator operating in South Los Angeles. The nickname suggested a single unknown killer stalking vulnerable women across the city. Yet reality proved far more complicated. Investigators would later determine that multiple serial offenders were active within the same general area during overlapping periods. Some murders attributed to the so-called Southside Slayer were committed by one individual, while others belonged to someone else entirely. This confusion delayed investigators' ability to isolate Turner as a suspect. Cases that shared certain characteristics were not always connected correctly, while unrelated crimes occasionally appeared linked simply because they occurred within the same neighborhoods. The result was an investigative landscape clouded by uncertainty. Meanwhile, the victims remained at the center of every unsolved file. Their names gradually accumulated in police records: Anita Fishman Breyer, Regina Washington, Andrea Triplett, Paula Vance, Natalie Price, Brenda Breeze, Diane Johnson, Annette Ernest, Desiree Jones, Mildred Beasley, Cynthia Johnson, Elandra Bunn, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams. Each woman had her own life, her own history, and her own relationships, even if many of those stories never reached newspaper headlines. Looking back today, it is easy to focus solely on the killer because his name dominates court documents and media coverage. But every investigative file began not with Chester Turner, but with a victim whose life ended violently and whose family, friends, or community members were left searching for answers. That perspective remains essential. The story of this case is not about elevating the murderer into some mythical criminal mastermind. In reality, Turner remained unidentified not because he possessed extraordinary intelligence or sophistication, but because the circumstances surrounding the crimes created extraordinary obstacles. The victims often belonged to groups that received less public attention. The city was experiencing exceptionally high levels of violent crime. Multiple serial offenders operated simultaneously. Most importantly, forensic DNA analysis had not yet reached the point where biological evidence collected from unknown offenders could reliably identify them years later. In many ways, the investigation became a race between advancing science and a killer who had already disappeared back into ordinary life after each crime. That race would continue long after the murders themselves had ended. For years, boxes of evidence remained carefully preserved inside police property rooms. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited old files. Technology evolved. Samples that once seemed incapable of revealing a suspect gradually became the key to unlocking one of Los Angeles's most significant cold case investigations. But at the beginning of this story, none of that was yet visible. All investigators knew was that women kept dying, families kept waiting, and somewhere within the streets of South Los Angeles, the person responsible continued to walk unnoticed among everyone else. In the next chapter, we will leave the future behind and return fully to the streets of South Los Angeles during the late 1980s, examining the environment in which these crimes unfolded and the conditions that allowed one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations to remain unsolved for more than a decade. The South Los Angeles of the late 1980s was a place defined by contradictions. It was home to resilient neighborhoods, close-knit families, churches, small businesses, and people determined to build better lives despite difficult circumstances. At the same time, it was a community facing extraordinary social and economic pressures. The crack cocaine epidemic had spread rapidly through many parts of the city. Addiction was devastating countless lives. Violent crime rates remained among the highest in the nation, and law enforcement agencies struggled to respond to an overwhelming number of emergencies every day. Understanding this environment is essential to understanding the Chester Turner case. Not because the community created the crimes, but because the conditions surrounding those years shaped how the crimes were investigated, how the victims were perceived, and why justice would take more than a decade to arrive. The streets surrounding Figueroa Street became central to the investigation that would unfold years later. During the period between 1987 and 1998, the area was known for visible street prostitution and open drug activity. Many people living there were battling addiction or homelessness, while others passed through temporarily in search of work, shelter, or resources. For some women, sex work had become a means of survival amid poverty and dependency. Others found themselves caught in cycles that were incredibly difficult to escape. These realities did not define their worth, but they did affect how visible they were to society. A woman who disappeared after leaving a stable home, regular employment, and daily contact with family often generated immediate concern. A woman living without permanent housing or struggling with addiction could vanish for days before anyone realized something was terribly wrong. That tragic imbalance became one of the defining themes of the Turner investigation. The victims shared no single biography, yet investigators eventually recognized recurring characteristics. Many were Black women. Several experienced homelessness. Some struggled with cocaine or crack addiction. Others engaged in prostitution. They represented some of the most vulnerable members of society, people whose daily lives already involved significant danger long before they encountered a murderer. Years later, prosecutors would argue that Turner deliberately selected women whose disappearances were less likely to trigger rapid investigations. The pattern did not emerge from speculation alone, but from the consistent backgrounds of many of the confirmed victims. While each woman's circumstances differed, the similarities became impossible to ignore once investigators finally connected the cases. Chester Dwayne Turner moved through this same environment. Born in Warren, Arkansas, on November 5, 1966. His early life changed dramatically after his parents divorced. He later relocated with his mother to Los Angeles, where he spent much of his youth. His formal education ended before graduation from high school, and adulthood brought little stability. He held temporary jobs, including work delivering pizza, but never maintained steady employment for long periods. Financial instability became a recurring feature of his life. At various times, he stayed in homeless shelters and spent considerable time in neighborhoods already struggling with addiction, poverty, and crime. Before investigators connected him to the murders, Turner had accumulated arrests involving theft, drug-related offenses, and violence. These prior encounters with the criminal justice system established that he was already known to law enforcement, but none of those earlier arrests connected him to homicide. Looking backward, after his conviction, it may seem surprising that someone with multiple prior offenses could remain unidentified as a serial killer. Yet this illustrates an important distinction. Prior criminal behavior does not automatically make someone a suspect in unrelated murder investigations, particularly when investigators lack direct physical evidence connecting that individual to a crime scene. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, forensic science was advancing, but DNA technology had not yet become the investigative tool it would later become. Crime scene investigators frequently recovered biological evidence, including semen in cases involving sexual assault. They carefully preserved clothing, biological samples, and other physical evidence according to the standards of the time. However, possessing biological evidence and identifying an unknown suspect were two very different challenges. Unless investigators already had a suspect for comparison, the evidence often remained only a silent record of the offender's presence. The technology that would later transform those samples into powerful investigative leads simply was not yet available in routine criminal investigations. Meanwhile, homicide detectives worked within an increasingly complicated landscape. Los Angeles was experiencing an exceptionally high number of violent crimes. Numerous murders required immediate attention, stretching investigative resources. Even more challenging was the realization, reached only years later, that several serial offenders were operating in South Los Angeles during overlapping time periods. At the time, investigators frequently referred to an unidentified Southside Slayer, believing one predator might be responsible for many of the murders involving vulnerable women. As additional evidence accumulated over the years, however, authorities determined that the nickname actually concealed multiple offenders rather than one. Some murders belonged to Chester Turner. Others belonged to different killers. The similarities among the crimes created understandable confusion, making it difficult to establish where one offender's pattern ended and another's began. This overlapping activity complicated every investigative decision. Detectives examining one homicide could identify similarities with previous cases, yet similarities alone could not establish a common offender. Victims were discovered in different locations. Individual crime scenes contained varying amounts of evidence. Witnesses, when available at all, often possessed limited or conflicting information. Without modern DNA database technology, connecting these cases required painstaking detective work that often produced more questions than answers. Against this backdrop, the murders continued. Investigators would later determine that Turner repeatedly sought out women in areas where prostitution and drug activity were common. According to evidence presented during later prosecutions, he typically approached victims on foot, spoke with them, and persuaded them to move to more isolated locations. In many of the confirmed cases, the victims were sexually assaulted before being strangled. Their bodies were then abandoned in vacant lots, alleys, or other secluded outdoor locations. Some victims were found partially clothed or unclothed, while others showed evidence that their bodies had been moved after death. Although these recurring characteristics eventually became critical in understanding the offender's methods, they were not, by themselves, enough to identify him during the years when the crimes were occurring. One of the earliest confirmed victims, Anita Fishman Breyer, illustrated the challenges investigators faced. After her body was discovered near Harbor Freeway in March 1987, forensic evidence established that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Biological material was collected, preserved, and documented. At the time, investigators could not know that this evidence would eventually become the cornerstone of a murder prosecution nearly 2 decades later. Similar situations would repeat themselves as additional victims were discovered throughout the following years. Each investigation added new reports, photographs, laboratory analyses, and preserved evidence to growing collections of unsolved case files. Yet despite these efforts, no suspect emerged capable of explaining the entire pattern. As years passed, another painful consequence became increasingly apparent. Families seeking answers often encountered silence. Some victims had limited contact with relatives because of homelessness or addiction. Others had become disconnected from traditional support networks. Their disappearances, therefore, did not always generate immediate missing person investigations. In many cases, discovery of the body itself became the first confirmation that something terrible had happened. These circumstances did not reflect a lack of value in the victims' lives. Rather, they exposed how easily people living on society's margins could become isolated from systems that might otherwise recognize danger sooner. Looking back, the Turner investigation serves as a powerful reminder that vulnerability can influence not only who becomes a victim, but also how quickly justice begins. Detectives continued gathering evidence, preserving biological samples, documenting similarities, and searching for suspects. Yet despite dedicated investigative work, the central mystery remained unsolved. The man responsible blended into the same neighborhoods where his victims lived. He attracted no extraordinary attention. He left no confession. He continued living an outwardly ordinary existence while the homicide files accumulated year after year. Unknown to everyone involved, the answer already existed inside evidence lockers maintained by law enforcement agencies. Tiny biological traces collected from multiple crime scenes had preserved the identity of the offender with remarkable precision. The only missing ingredient was the scientific capability to interpret them. As forensic DNA analysis advanced during the 1990s and early 2000s, those preserved samples would become far more valuable than anyone could have imagined when they were first collected. Eventually, an entirely separate criminal investigation would provide the missing piece that detectives had been seeking for more than a decade. It would not begin with one of the homicide cases at all, but with a 2002 sexual assault investigation that, at first glance, appeared unrelated. That unexpected development would transform years of unanswered questions into one of the most significant DNA-driven serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history. March 1987 did not immediately stand out as the beginning of one of the longest serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history. To the detectives responding that month, it was another homicide requiring careful documentation, forensic examination, and a search for answers that, at the time, seemed painfully distant. The victim was 21-year-old Anita Fishman Breyer. Her body was discovered near Harbor Freeway, an area that, like many parts of South Los Angeles during that period, frequently exposed investigators to violent crime. Every homicide demanded attention, yet there was nothing at that moment to suggest that Anita's death would eventually become the first confirmed murder in a series that would stretch across more than 11 years. The crime scene revealed disturbing but important facts. Anita had been sexually assaulted before her death. The medical examination determined that she had been strangled. Her body had been left outdoors after the attack, abandoned rather than concealed. Crime scene investigators documented every observable detail with the methods available in the late 1980s. Photographs were taken, physical evidence was collected, biological samples were preserved. Investigators understood the importance of safeguarding anything that might one day identify the offender, even though the technology to fully exploit that evidence had not yet matured. They could not know that these carefully preserved samples would remain silent for years before, eventually providing one of the strongest pieces of evidence against Chester Turner. In the days following Anita's death, detectives pursued the investigative avenues available to them. They examined the immediate area, searched for witnesses, reviewed available information, and attempted to reconstruct her final movements. Like many homicide investigations, progress depended heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, and the possibility that someone might recognize a suspect or provide crucial information. But violent crimes occurring in neighborhoods affected by poverty, addiction, and frequent criminal activity often presented extraordinary investigative challenges. Witnesses were sometimes reluctant to cooperate. Others had only fragmented observations. Some simply had not seen anything useful. As a result, Anita's murder remained unsolved. Time moved forward, but the unanswered questions stayed behind. Months became years, and additional women began appearing under circumstances that investigators would later recognize as strikingly similar. Each new case arrived with its own crime scene, its own victim, and its own grieving families or communities. At first glance, the similarities did not necessarily prove a single offender. South Los Angeles was experiencing an exceptionally high number of violent crimes, and detectives were already handling numerous complex investigations simultaneously. Still, certain recurring characteristics slowly emerged. Victims were frequently discovered in vacant lots, alleys, or other isolated outdoor locations. Several had suffered sexual assaults before death. Strangulation appeared repeatedly as the cause of death. Property theft did not seem to be the primary motivation. In some cases, bodies showed evidence that they had been moved after death. Individually, none of these characteristics could identify a killer. Together, they hinted at a developing pattern that investigators would only fully appreciate years later. During this period, Chester Turner was not viewed as the central figure behind these crimes. He lived within the same neighborhoods where many of the victims spent time. He moved through streets familiar to people struggling with homelessness, addiction, or unstable housing. According to information later presented during prosecution, Turner typically approached women in areas associated with prostitution and drug activity. Rather than using obvious force at the beginning of an encounter, investigators concluded that he often initiated conversations, offering drugs or proposing sexual activity before persuading victims to move toward more secluded locations. This method allowed him to avoid drawing immediate attention. In busy urban environments where strangers frequently interacted on sidewalks or street corners, Such conversations did not necessarily appear suspicious to passersby. Once isolated from public view, however, the encounters became deadly. Evidence presented years later demonstrated a recurring sequence in many of the confirmed murders. Victims were sexually assaulted, then manually strangled or strangled using a ligature. After death, their bodies were abandoned outdoors. Investigators did not uncover evidence showing prolonged torture or elaborate staging of crime scenes. Instead, the murders reflected a consistent and devastating pattern focused on vulnerable women who could be approached without attracting significant attention. This recurring methodology became increasingly important as additional cases accumulated, although it remained insufficient by itself to identify the offender. Throughout the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, the list of victims continued to grow. Andrea Triplett became one of the women later linked to Turner through DNA evidence. Paula Vance would also be identified among the confirmed victims. Natalie Price, Brenda Breeze, Diane Johnson, Annette Ernest, Desiree Jones, Mildred Beasley, Cynthia Johnson, Elandra Bunn, Mary Edwards, Deborah Williams, and Regina Washington would eventually become part of the same tragic investigation. Although each victim had her own life story, investigators ultimately recognized recurring characteristics that connected many of the cases. Several women experienced homelessness. Others struggled with cocaine or crack addiction. Some engaged in prostitution. These circumstances did not define who they were, but they influenced how vulnerable they became to someone intentionally searching for victims who were less likely to receive immediate public attention if they disappeared. Years later, prosecutors argued that Turner deliberately exploited this vulnerability. The evidence supporting that conclusion rested not on speculation about his thoughts, but on the consistent pattern visible across the victims selected during more than a decade of killings. As investigators searched for answers, another complication emerged. Los Angeles authorities increasingly believed they were confronting a serial killer operating in South Los Angeles. The media and investigators often referred to this unknown offender as the South Side Slayer. At the time, the nickname represented an attempt to explain a growing number of murders involving women living on society's margins. However, later investigations revealed that the reality was considerably more complex. Multiple serial offenders were active in South Los Angeles during overlapping periods. Some murders initially grouped together under one label actually belonged to entirely different perpetrators. This overlap created extraordinary investigative confusion. Detectives attempting to identify one serial offender were unknowingly examining evidence produced by several unrelated killers. Cases appeared similar because vulnerable victims, comparable locations, and similar methods overlapped across different offenders. Distinguishing one pattern from another became exceptionally difficult without definitive forensic evidence. Consequently, the investigation into Anita Fishman Breyer's murder and those that followed advanced only in small increments. Biological evidence remained preserved in police laboratories, but it could not yet identify an unknown offender. Detectives documented similarities while continuing to pursue leads that ultimately failed to resolve the cases. Families waited for answers that never seemed to arrive. Meanwhile, the individual responsible continued living without being connected to the murders. Chester Turner did not suddenly disappear after committing these crimes. He remained in the community, blending into the same neighborhoods where investigators searched for him without realizing his identity. One of the most important lessons from this period is that the absence of an arrest did not reflect a lack of investigative effort. Crime scene investigators collected evidence with remarkable care, preserving biological samples according to procedures that would later prove invaluable. Detectives interviewed witnesses, analyzed available information, and continued revisiting unsolved files. What they lacked was not determination, but technology. DNA profiling capable of identifying an unknown suspect through a statewide database had not yet become the powerful investigative resource it would later become. The evidence existed, carefully stored and cataloged, waiting for scientific advances that no investigator in 1987 could fully anticipate. As the years passed, the pattern became increasingly tragic. More women lost their lives. More homicide files entered police archives. More evidence accumulated inside evidence rooms, each item carrying silent information that could not yet be translated into a name. Looking back today, it is tempting to imagine that the similarities should have made the solution obvious. Yet history rarely unfolds with the clarity available in hindsight. Detectives confronted overlapping crime scenes, multiple active offenders, limited forensic capabilities, and victims whose disappearances often attracted less immediate public attention because of their difficult life circumstances. These factors combined to create one of the most challenging serial murder investigations Los Angeles had ever faced. Unknown to investigators, however, the very evidence they had painstakingly preserved from Anita Fishman Breyer's murder and the murders that followed would eventually become the decisive factor in solving the entire case. Years later, after an unrelated criminal investigation required Chester Turner to provide a DNA sample, the silent evidence collected from these forgotten crime scenes would finally begin to speak. What had remained hidden throughout the late 1980s and the entire decade that followed was about to emerge with extraordinary clarity, linking one man to a series of murders that had haunted South Los Angeles for more than 11 years. As the years passed, what had first appeared to investigators as isolated tragedies gradually revealed a disturbing consistency. Each new homicide added another file to an already overburdened system. Another victim whose life had ended under violent circumstances, and another family left searching for answers that never seemed to come. Yet because these murders occurred across different locations and over an extended period between 1987 and 1998, the full pattern remained difficult to recognize in real time. Only after advances in forensic science allowed detectives to revisit the evidence would the similarities become unmistakable. Looking back at the complete investigation, prosecutors argued that Chester Dwayne Turner had developed a remarkably consistent method of selecting victims, approaching them, committing the crimes, and abandoning the bodies. That consistency became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The neighborhood surrounding Figueroa Street remained at the center of Turner's activities throughout the 11-year period. This area, already struggling with the consequences of widespread drug addiction, prostitution, homelessness, and violent crime, provided opportunities for someone seeking vulnerable victims. According to evidence later presented in court, Turner typically encountered women in these familiar streets rather than traveling long distances in search of victims. The fact that he knew the area well allowed him to move without attracting unusual attention. Busy sidewalks, constant pedestrian traffic, and the presence of individuals coming and going at all hours meant that brief conversations between strangers rarely appeared suspicious. This environment became an unfortunate advantage for the offender. Investigators later concluded that Turner generally approached women directly instead of relying on elaborate deception. The available evidence suggested a recurring pattern. He would speak with women in areas known for prostitution or drug activity, offering drugs or proposing sexual activity before encouraging them to move toward locations that offered greater privacy. There is no verified evidence that he relied on firearms or other obvious weapons to initially control his victims. Instead, the encounters often began in ways that appeared ordinary within the context of those neighborhoods. It was only after the victims were isolated that the violence began. This method reduced the likelihood of attracting immediate attention from bystanders and helps explain why so few eyewitnesses were able to describe the attacks themselves. Once investigators compared the confirmed homicide cases side by side years later, another pattern emerged with striking consistency. Many victims had been sexually assaulted before death. Medical examinations repeatedly identified strangulation as the cause of death, either through manual force or ligature strangulation. Following the murders, The bodies were abandoned outdoors rather than concealed in buildings or buried. Vacant lots, alleys, and neglected areas became recurring recovery sites. Several victims were discovered partially clothed or unclothed, while some bodies showed indications that they had been moved after death. Although every crime scene contained unique details, the overall similarities became increasingly difficult to dismiss once modern forensic analysis linked them together. Throughout these years, the list of confirmed victims steadily grew. Their names deserve to be remembered not merely as entries in court records, but as individuals whose lives were violently taken. Anita Fishman Breyer was the first confirmed victim in March 1987. Her murder established many of the characteristics that investigators would later identify. Throughout the series, Regina Washington became one of the most widely discussed victims because she was approximately 6 to 7 months pregnant when she was murdered. Andrea Triplett, Paula Vance, Natalie Price, Brenda Breeze, Diane Johnson, Annette Ernest, Desiree Jones, Mildred Beasley, Cynthia Johnson, Elandra Bunn, Mary Edwards, and Deborah Williams would all eventually be linked to Turner through the evidence presented during prosecution. Each name represents a separate human story, even though many details of their personal lives remain absent from the public record. What investigators could establish, however, was that many of these women shared circumstances that made them particularly vulnerable. Several struggled with cocaine or crack addiction. Some experienced homelessness or unstable housing. Others engaged in prostitution. These shared vulnerabilities became one of the central themes of the prosecution's case. The argument was not that these circumstances defined the victims, but that they made them easier for Turner to target while simultaneously reducing the likelihood that their disappearances would generate immediate, large-scale investigations. The reality reflected a painful truth about how society often responds differently to victims, depending upon their circumstances. Women living without permanent housing or battling addiction frequently had fewer consistent contacts with family or employers who might quickly report them missing. Some had become isolated after years of hardship. Others moved frequently between shelters, temporary accommodations, or the streets. In such situations, days or even weeks could pass before anyone recognized that something was seriously wrong. This delay created valuable time for the offender and added another obstacle for investigators, attempting to reconstruct each victim's final movements. Turner appeared to understand this vulnerability. Although prosecutors could never fully explain his personal motivations, the consistent selection of similar victims across more than a decade suggested deliberate targeting rather than random chance. Despite the growing number of homicides, investigators still faced extraordinary challenges in establishing that all the crimes belonged to a single offender. The overlapping presence of multiple serial killers operating in South Los Angeles complicated every investigative decision. During this same era, authorities used the term Southside Slayer as a collective description for what appeared to be one serial murderer targeting women in the area. Years later, however, investigators determined that this assumption had been incorrect. Instead of one killer, there were several offenders committing similar crimes during overlapping periods. Some victims originally thought to belong to one investigation were eventually reassigned to another, after DNA evidence provided clearer answers. This confusion delayed the recognition of Turner's individual pattern. Detectives examining one homicide often found similarities with others, but lacked sufficient scientific evidence to separate one offender from another. Consequently, the homicide files continued to accumulate without producing a definitive suspect. Biological evidence collected from many crime scenes remained preserved in evidence storage. But the technology available during much of the investigation could not yet unlock its full value. Crime laboratories carefully maintained semen samples, clothing, and other forensic materials according to established procedures, not realizing that these preserved items would one day solve crimes that had resisted every other investigative method. The importance of this careful evidence preservation cannot be overstated. Had those samples been lost, contaminated, or discarded, the future prosecution of Chester Turner might never have been possible. Instead, investigators unknowingly preserved the offender's identity for more than a decade, waiting only for science to catch up with the evidence. During the years when the murders continued, Turner himself remained largely invisible within the broader investigation. Although he had prior arrests involving theft, drugs, and violence, nothing directly connected him to the homicide cases. Law enforcement officers routinely encounter individuals with criminal histories, and prior offenses alone cannot establish responsibility for unrelated murders. Without a forensic link, Turner remained simply another resident moving through neighborhoods already burdened by high levels of crime. This reality demonstrates an important aspect of serial murder investigations. Contrary to popular portrayals in fiction, offenders are not always identified through dramatic behavioral clues or spectacular investigative breakthroughs. Sometimes they remain hidden simply because no available evidence points directly toward them until technology evolves enough to reveal what had always been present. The years between 1987 and 1998, therefore, became a race that investigators did not yet realize they were running. Every homicide added more physical evidence to police storage facilities. Every preserved biological sample quietly retained information about the person who left it behind. Every carefully documented crime scene increased the possibility that future forensic methods might eventually establish connections impossible to recognize at the time. The murders themselves eventually stopped after 1998, but the investigation never truly ended. Detectives continued reviewing unsolved cases, preserving evidence, and waiting for new leads that rarely appeared. Families continued living without answers. Some wondered whether the killer had died, left California, or simply vanished forever. None could know that the decisive breakthrough would arrive not through one of the homicide investigations themselves, but through an entirely different criminal case several years later. In 2002, a sexual assault investigation would require Chester Turner to provide a DNA sample under California law. That single legal requirement would trigger one of the most significant forensic breakthroughs in Los Angeles history. Within preserved biological evidence collected from forgotten crime scenes, investigators would finally discover the scientific connection that transformed more than a decade of unsolved murders into a single, identifiable pattern pointing directly to one man. The silent evidence gathered throughout those difficult years had never stopped telling its story. It had simply been waiting for someone to learn how to listen. Among the 14 murders for which Chester Dwayne Turner was ultimately convicted, one case stood apart because of the profound tragedy it represented and the legal questions it would later raise. It was the murder of Regina Washington, a woman who was approximately 6 to 7 months pregnant when her life was taken. While every victim in this investigation deserves equal recognition and respect, Regina's case came to symbolize not only the devastating violence inflicted by the offender, but also the complex intersection of forensic evidence, criminal law, and the long pursuit of justice. Years after her death, her case would become the subject of review by the California Supreme Court. That review did not overturn Turner's responsibility for Regina's murder itself, nor did it alter his death sentences for the multiple murders of which he had been convicted. Instead, it addressed a specific legal issue concerning the separate conviction involving the death of Regina's unborn child. Understanding that distinction is essential to understanding both the legal history of the case and the broader impact of Turner's crimes. Regina Washington's murder occurred during the period in which Turner repeatedly targeted women living in vulnerable circumstances across South Los Angeles. Like many of the other confirmed victims, she encountered the offender in an environment already marked by poverty, addiction, prostitution, and violence. Prosecutors later demonstrated through forensic evidence that Turner sexually assaulted Regina before killing her by strangulation. The forensic examination established that she was pregnant at the time of her death, with the pregnancy estimated at approximately 6 to 7 months. The death of both Regina and her unborn child transformed the crime into one of the most emotionally devastating cases connected to Turner. The circumstances reflected not merely the loss of one life, but the destruction of two futures. Although the public record preserves only limited details regarding Regina's personal life beyond the evidence introduced during legal proceedings, her case reminds us that every victim represented far more than a name in court documents. Behind each investigation existed families, friends, and communities forced to confront sudden and irreversible loss. In cases involving victims whose lives had already been shaped by hardship, that grief often unfolded outside public attention. Newspapers could summarize a homicide in a few paragraphs, and court records could reduce an individual to dates and forensic findings, but neither could fully capture the life that had existed before the crime occurred. Regina Washington was no exception. Her murder became one of the central cases presented during Turner's prosecution because the physical evidence established a clear connection between the offender and the crime. By the time prosecutors brought the case to trial, advances in DNA technology had transformed evidence collected years earlier into compelling forensic proof. Biological samples preserved from the original investigation could now be analyzed with scientific methods unavailable at the time of the murder. These advances allowed experts to compare DNA recovered from crime scenes with Turner's DNA profile. After his sample entered California's database following his 2002 rape conviction, the resulting matches became some of the strongest evidence presented during the homicide. Prosecutions, rather than relying primarily upon eyewitness testimony or a confession, prosecutors built their case on forensic science. Regina's case therefore illustrated both the brutality of the crimes and the extraordinary importance of preserving biological evidence for future examination. During the original trial proceedings, Turner was convicted not only of Regina Washington's murder, but also of a separate offense relating to the death of her unborn child. At that time, the prosecution argued that the evidence supported criminal responsibility for both deaths. The jury accepted that argument, and the conviction became part of the broader series of judgments entered against Turner. However, the legal story did not end there. Years after the convictions, the California Supreme Court reviewed one specific aspect of the case. In 2020, the court concluded that the separate conviction concerning the unborn child could not stand because expert testimony presented during the proceedings had not satisfied the procedural legal requirements governing that particular issue. Importantly, the court did not determine that Turner was innocent of murdering Regina Washington, nor did it overturn the convictions for the 14 murders or disturb the death sentences imposed for those crimes. Instead, the decision addressed a narrow legal question concerning the evidentiary basis for the additional fetal murder conviction. As a result, that single conviction was reversed while the remainder of Turner's judgments remained intact. This distinction is often misunderstood when the case is summarized. Some readers mistakenly assume that the court questioned the overall evidence against Turner. That is not what occurred. The overwhelming forensic evidence linking Turner to multiple murders remained unchanged. His convictions for Regina Washington's murder and the other homicide cases continued to stand. The California Supreme Court's ruling reflected the legal principle that every criminal conviction must satisfy specific procedural and evidentiary standards, even in cases involving defendants already convicted of numerous other serious crimes. The decision therefore demonstrates how appellate courts examine individual legal issues separately, rather than simply reconsidering the overall character of the defendant. Regina Washington's case also highlights another important aspect of the Turner investigation: the role of DNA evidence in restoring attention to victims whose deaths had remained unresolved for years. Before forensic science identified Turner, Regina's murder had been one among many unsolved homicides involving vulnerable women in South Los Angeles. Without a named offender, the investigation remained incomplete despite the careful work performed by detectives and crime scene investigators. Once DNA technology established the connection, however, The preserved evidence became a voice speaking across decades. Scientific analysis succeeded where traditional investigative methods had reached their limits. The evidence collected at Regina's crime scene, carefully preserved despite years of uncertainty, eventually became an essential part of the prosecution's case. Her story therefore illustrates the extraordinary patience often required in cold case investigations. Justice sometimes depends not upon dramatic breakthroughs in the moment, but upon evidence preserved long enough for future scientific advances to unlock its significance. Regina's murder also underscores the broader human cost of Turner's 11-year killing spree. Prosecutors argued that Turner repeatedly selected women who occupied some of the most vulnerable positions within society. Many struggled with addiction, homelessness, or unstable living conditions. These circumstances often delayed recognition of disappearances, complicated investigations, and reduced the public attention devoted to individual cases. Regina's murder became especially visible because of her pregnancy. Yet every victim represented a similar failure of society to protect those living at its margins. The investigation ultimately demonstrated that vulnerability itself had become part of the offender's strategy. He operated in neighborhoods where many women faced extraordinary daily risks even before encountering him. This reality should never be interpreted as diminishing the value of the victims' lives. On the contrary, the Turner investigation has become a powerful reminder that every victim deserves equal investigative effort regardless of social circumstances. The eventual success of the prosecution rested not on assumptions about lifestyle, but on objective forensic evidence linking one individual to repeated acts of violence. In many respects, Regina Washington's case came to represent the emotional center of the investigation. It reminded investigators, prosecutors, jurors, and the public that behind every forensic report stood an individual whose future had been stolen. The DNA evidence explained who committed the crimes, but it could never explain the personal losses suffered by families and communities. Scientific certainty can identify an offender, secure convictions, and correct historical uncertainties, yet it cannot restore lives that have already been taken. As the legal proceedings moved forward, investigators continued reviewing additional evidence from other unsolved homicide files. The success achieved through DNA analysis encouraged authorities to re-examine preserved biological evidence collected during earlier investigations. Those renewed efforts would ultimately lead prosecutors to file additional murder charges beyond the original trial, expanding the case against Turner even further. At the same time, another startling discovery would emerge from the renewed investigation. DNA evidence would reveal not only the identity of the true offender, but also that at least one man had previously been wrongfully convicted for murders that Turner had actually committed. The next stage of the investigation would therefore demonstrate that forensic science could accomplish two equally important goals: identifying the guilty and restoring freedom to the innocent. For more than 11 years, Chester Dwayne Turner continued to move through South Los Angeles without being identified as the man responsible for a growing number of murders. Looking back after his convictions, one of the most difficult questions surrounding the case remains deceptively simple. How is it possible for a serial killer to remain undetected for so long? The answer cannot be reduced to a single mistake, one overlooked clue, or one missed opportunity. Instead, the investigation reveals how several independent factors combined to create an environment in which justice was repeatedly delayed. The victims themselves, the conditions of the neighborhoods where the crimes occurred, the presence of multiple serial offenders, and the limitations of forensic technology all intersected in ways that made an already difficult investigation extraordinarily complex. Understanding these factors is essential, not to excuse the delay, but to understand why solving the murders required advances that simply did not yet exist when the first victims were found. One of the most significant reasons was the vulnerability of the victims. Many of the women Turner targeted were living under circumstances that exposed them to extraordinary Daily risks. Several struggled with cocaine or crack addiction. Some experienced homelessness or unstable housing. Others survived through prostitution in neighborhoods already affected by poverty and violence. These circumstances never diminished their worth as human beings, but they profoundly influenced the pace and direction of investigations. A person with stable employment, regular contact with relatives, and a permanent address is often reported missing quickly when normal routines suddenly stop. By contrast, individuals experiencing homelessness or addiction may already have irregular patterns of communication, making absences more difficult to recognize immediately. Family members, when they remained involved, sometimes faced uncertainty about whether a loved one had simply moved elsewhere, entered treatment, or temporarily disappeared, as had happened before. In some cases, victims had become isolated from relatives altogether. These realities meant that disappearances were not always reported immediately, and in certain instances the discovery of a body became the first confirmation that a woman had died. Every delay narrowed the opportunities available to investigators. Memories faded, witnesses became harder to locate, and physical evidence at outdoor crime scenes deteriorated over time. Turner appeared to exploit precisely these vulnerabilities. Prosecutors argued that his victims were not selected randomly, but because they were less likely to attract immediate attention if they vanished. The consistency of the victim profiles across the confirmed cases supported that conclusion. A second major obstacle involved the geography of the crimes themselves. Turner did not leave every victim in one predictable location. Bodies were discovered in vacant lots, alleys, abandoned spaces, and other outdoor areas scattered throughout South Los Angeles. Although many of the crime scenes shared similarities, they remained physically separated across a large urban environment already experiencing an overwhelming number of violent offenses. Detectives assigned to one homicide did not automatically possess complete knowledge of every comparable investigation occurring elsewhere in the city. Information certainly moved between investigative teams, but determining whether separate cases belonged to the same offender required evidence that was often incomplete. Similar methods of killing alone could not establish a common perpetrator because different offenders sometimes committed crimes in similar ways. The scattered nature of the crime scenes therefore delayed recognition of the broader pattern that only became obvious years later when all of the evidence was reviewed together. Perhaps the greatest source of confusion came from a reality that investigators could not fully appreciate until much later. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, South Los Angeles was not confronting a single serial killer targeting vulnerable women. Instead, multiple serial offenders were operating during overlapping periods. As investigators attempted to connect murders sharing common characteristics, they frequently referred to an unidentified perpetrator using the name Southside Slayer. At the time, the label reflected a reasonable effort to organize numerous unsolved homicides involving women found under similar circumstances. Yet subsequent investigations demonstrated that the title masked a far more complicated truth. The murders attributed to the so-called Southside Slayer did not all belong to one offender. Different killers committed different crimes. Some cases ultimately belonged to Chester Turner, while others were later attributed to entirely different individuals. This overlap significantly complicated investigative efforts. Detectives attempting to identify one offender were unknowingly studying evidence generated by several unrelated murderers. Similar victim profiles, similar locations, and similar causes of death created patterns that appeared connected even when they were not. Without definitive forensic evidence capable of separating one offender from another, distinguishing those overlapping patterns became extraordinarily difficult. Even when investigators recognized similarities between crime scenes, they lacked the scientific tools needed to determine with certainty whether biological evidence recovered from separate locations originated from the same person. That limitation brings us to perhaps the single most important factor in the entire investigation: the state of DNA technology during the years when the murders occurred. Today, forensic DNA analysis is often regarded as one of the most powerful tools available to criminal investigators. It is easy to assume that biological evidence automatically identifies offenders. During the late 1980s, however, that assumption would have been incorrect. Crime scene investigators certainly understood the importance of collecting biological material. Whenever possible, in many of Turner's cases, semen samples and other forms of biological evidence were carefully recovered and preserved. Clothing was retained. Laboratory examinations documented important forensic findings. Detectives did not ignore this evidence. The problem was that the available technology could not yet transform those samples into the investigative breakthroughs that later became routine. Unless investigators already had a suspect whose DNA could be directly compared with crime scene evidence, the biological material often remained only an unidentified genetic profile without a name attached to it. This technological limitation meant that investigators possessed crucial evidence years before they possessed the means to interpret it fully. The identity of the offender had effectively been preserved from the very beginning, locked within microscopic biological traces collected from crime scenes across South Los Angeles. Yet those traces remained silent because science had not advanced far enough to reveal whose DNA they contained. The investigators of the late 1980s therefore faced an unusual paradox. They had gathered evidence that would eventually solve the case, but they lacked the future scientific developments necessary to unlock its meaning. Fortunately, the evidence itself was not discarded. Crime laboratories preserved the biological samples according to accepted forensic procedures. This careful preservation became one of the most important decisions in the entire investigation, even though those responsible could not have known how valuable the evidence would become years later. Had those samples deteriorated or been lost, many of the later convictions might never have been possible. Instead, every preserved sample quietly waited for advances in forensic science that would eventually transform cold case investigations across California. Another reason Turner remained unidentified for so long was that nothing in his previous criminal history directly connected him to homicide. Before his arrest in the murder investigation, he had accumulated convictions involving theft, drug offenses, violence, and later rape. Those offenses established that he had previous contact with law enforcement, but criminal records alone cannot identify someone as a serial murderer. Large cities contain many individuals with prior arrests who have no connection whatsoever to unsolved homicide investigations. Investigators require objective evidence linking a suspect to specific crimes. Until DNA provided that connection, Turner remained one of many individuals moving through neighborhoods already burdened by high crime rates. His earlier offenses did not automatically place him at the center of investigations involving murdered women. Looking back, it may seem surprising that someone living within the same communities as many of his victims escaped suspicion for so many years. Yet hindsight provides clarity unavailable to investigators working in real time. Detectives confronted hundreds of individual facts without knowing which would ultimately matter. They examined separate crime scenes, interviewed available witnesses, documented recurring patterns, and preserved every piece of forensic evidence they could recover. They worked within the technological limitations of their era while facing overlapping investigations involving multiple violent offenders. The Turner case therefore illustrates that even diligent investigative work can be constrained by the scientific capabilities available at a particular moment in history. In the end, the murders stopped not because investigators had identified the killer, but because the series itself came to an end in 1998. For several years afterward, the homicide files remained unsolved, their evidence stored inside police laboratories and evidence rooms. Detectives continued searching for answers, unaware that the decisive breakthrough would come from an entirely different criminal investigation. In 2002, Turner committed a rape that resulted in his conviction. Under California law, That conviction required him to provide a DNA sample for inclusion in the state's growing forensic database. What seemed at first like a routine legal requirement would soon become the turning point. Investigators had been waiting for since 1987. Once Turner's DNA entered the system, years of preserved evidence would finally reveal the identity hidden within it, transforming more than a decade of unanswered murders into one of the most significant DNA-driven serial homicide investigations in Los Angeles history. For more than a decade, the evidence existed without a name. Detectives had preserved biological samples from multiple crime scenes, documented recurring patterns of violence, and maintained unsolved homicide files despite years of frustration. They knew the murders shared important similarities, but they could not identify the person responsible. The breakthrough that finally changed everything did not begin with one of the homicide investigations. It began in 2002 with an entirely different crime. That unexpected connection would transform forgotten forensic evidence into one of the most significant serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history and demonstrate the extraordinary power of DNA to solve cases that once seemed impossible. In 2002, Chester Dwayne Turner was arrested after raping a 47-year-old woman. Unlike the murders that had remained unsolved throughout the previous decade, this offense resulted in his conviction. Under California law, individuals convicted of certain serious crimes were required to provide DNA samples for inclusion in the state's forensic database. At the time, this requirement represented part of a broader effort to expand the use of DNA technology in criminal investigations. For Turner, however, it became the moment that ultimately ended years of anonymity. His DNA profile was collected according to standard legal procedures and entered into California's growing database. There was no public indication at that moment that investigators expected the sample to connect him to multiple unsolved homicides. It was simply another DNA profile added to a system designed to compare known offenders with biological evidence recovered from crime scenes throughout the state. What happened next fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. After Turner's DNA entered the database, forensic analysts discovered that his genetic profile matched biological evidence preserved from several unsolved murder investigations. The significance of this finding cannot be overstated. For years, detectives had possessed biological evidence collected from victims who had been sexually assaulted before being killed. Those samples had remained carefully preserved because investigators understood that future scientific developments might eventually make them useful. Now, for the first time, science had provided the missing link. The unknown genetic profile recovered from multiple crime scenes finally belonged to a specific individual. Chester Turner was no longer simply another offender with a criminal record. He had become the central suspect in a series of murders stretching back to 1987. The DNA match did far more than identify one possible suspect. It provided investigators with a scientific foundation for reopening numerous cold case files that had remained unsolved for years. The Los Angeles Police Department began reviewing the evidence collected throughout the lengthy investigation. Detectives revisited crime scenes through photographs, reports, and preserved physical evidence. Laboratory personnel re-examined biological samples using forensic techniques far more advanced than those available when the murders had originally occurred. Clothing recovered from victims received renewed attention. Preserved semen samples were subjected to modern DNA analysis. Investigators compared biological evidence from multiple homicide scenes, searching for connections that earlier technology had been unable to establish. The process was meticulous and methodical. Every potential match required careful scientific verification before investigators could draw conclusions. Unlike dramatic portrayals of forensic science in television dramas, real-world DNA investigations demand patience, repeated testing, and strict laboratory procedures to ensure accuracy. The investigators understood that these cases involved murders committed many years earlier. Any error could undermine prosecutions that families had waited decades to see. Consequently, every DNA comparison underwent rigorous examination before becoming part of the official investigation. As additional analyses were completed, the picture became increasingly clear. Turner's DNA appeared repeatedly across multiple homicide investigations that had once seemed separate and unrelated. Cases spanning more than a decade suddenly aligned with one another through objective scientific evidence. Instead of relying primarily upon circumstantial similarities, such as victim profiles or methods of killing, investigators now possess direct biological evidence connecting one individual to numerous crime scenes. This development fundamentally changed the investigation. Questions that had remained unanswered for years now received clear scientific explanations. The recurring pattern of vulnerable victims, sexual assault, strangulation, and abandoned bodies was no longer simply an observed similarity. DNA demonstrated that many of these crimes had indeed been committed by the same offender. The importance of preserving evidence throughout the original investigations became immediately apparent. Crime scene investigators working in the late 1980s and early 1990s had no way of knowing precisely when or how future forensic science would evolve. Yet by carefully collecting and preserving biological material, they unknowingly safeguarded the key that would eventually solve the case. Every properly stored sample became an investment in future justice. Had those materials been discarded because investigators lacked immediate suspects, many of the later convictions might never have occurred. Instead, the preserved evidence remained available until technology finally caught up with the crimes. This aspect of the Turner investigation has since been recognized as one of the strongest demonstrations of why cold case evidence should be maintained whenever possible. The success of the investigation depended not upon discovering new physical evidence years later, but upon extracting new information from evidence that had existed all along. Advances in forensic DNA analysis transformed what had once been inconclusive biological material into compelling courtroom evidence. Investigators who had spent years confronting unanswered questions suddenly possessed a reliable scientific pathway toward identifying the killer. As detectives continued reviewing old case files, they compared DNA recovered from additional victims with Turner's newly established profile. More matches emerged. The number of linked homicides steadily increased. Each confirmed match represented another family finally receiving answers after years of uncertainty. Although nothing could erase the suffering caused by the murders, identifying the offender marked a profound turning point. The victims were no longer simply names attached to unsolved cases. Their investigations now pointed toward a specific individual whose responsibility could be demonstrated through objective forensic evidence. Prosecutors recognized that DNA would become the cornerstone of the criminal case against Turner. Rather than relying heavily on eyewitness testimony, which was often unavailable after so many years, they could present biological evidence directly connecting him to the victims. Forensic experts prepared to explain DNA analysis to jurors in clear, understandable terms. They would demonstrate how genetic profiles recovered from crime scenes matched Turner's DNA with extraordinary reliability according to accepted scientific standards. In addition to the DNA evidence itself, prosecutors examined the broader similarities among the murders. The recurring victim profiles, the locations, the evidence of sexual assault, and the repeated use of strangulation all reinforced the scientific findings. Together, these elements formed a comprehensive picture of an offender who had operated across South Los Angeles for more than 11 years before being identified. The investigation also underscored an important principle about the relationship between science and criminal justice. DNA alone does not replace careful detective work. Instead, it strengthens investigations built upon thorough evidence collection, accurate documentation, and proper preservation of physical evidence. The officers and forensic personnel who originally processed the homicide scenes had laid the foundation years earlier through meticulous work. Even though they could not yet identify the offender, advances in science simply allowed later investigators to unlock the information those crime scenes had preserved from the beginning. The Turner case, therefore, became one of Los Angeles's most significant examples of successful cold case investigation through forensic DNA. It demonstrated that evidence collected decades earlier could retain extraordinary value when preserved correctly. It also reinforced the importance of maintaining unsolved case files rather than assuming that a lack of immediate answers meant the truth would never emerge. For the families of the victims, the DNA matches represented something even more meaningful than scientific progress. After years of unanswered questions, uncertainty, and waiting, the investigations finally moved toward accountability. The evidence that had remained silent throughout the 1980s and 1990s was now speaking with remarkable clarity. The stage was set for prosecutors to present one of the most compelling forensic homicide cases in Los Angeles history. In 2007, Chester Turner would stand trial for the first group of murders linked to him through DNA evidence. The proceedings would rely heavily upon forensic science, expert testimony, and years of painstaking investigative work. Yet the investigation was still not complete. Even as prosecutors prepared for trial, additional evidence continued to emerge from preserved homicide files, suggesting that the full extent of Turner's crimes might not yet have been uncovered. The discovery of Chester Dwayne Turner's DNA matches transformed a collection of forgotten homicide files into one of the most significant serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history. After years of uncertainty, investigators finally had what they had been missing since the first confirmed murder in 1987: a direct scientific connection between one person and multiple crime scenes. But identifying the offender was only the beginning. The next challenge was proving the crimes beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Prosecutors needed to carefully organize more than a decade of evidence, explain complex forensic findings to a jury, and demonstrate that the biological evidence was not merely a coincidence, but part of a consistent pattern of violence committed by one man. In 2007, Chester Turner faced trial for the first group of murders connected to the DNA investigation. The prosecution's case centered heavily on forensic evidence. Unlike many homicide trials where eyewitness testimony plays a central role, the Turner case was built primarily on scientific findings. Many of the murders had occurred years earlier. Witness memories had faded. Some potential witnesses were no longer available. Traditional investigative methods that might have been useful immediately after the crimes had become far less reliable after the passage of time. DNA, therefore, became the foundation of the prosecution's argument. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that biological material recovered from multiple victims matched Turner's DNA profile. The samples came from crime scenes that had remained unsolved for years. When the same genetic profile appeared across different homicide investigations, the probability of coincidence became extraordinarily small. For jurors, the significance was clear. The same individual's DNA had been recovered in connection with multiple murdered women whose cases had previously appeared separate. Expert witnesses explained the forensic process, describing how DNA profiles are created and compared. Their role was not simply to present scientific results, but to help the jury understand why those results were meaningful. DNA evidence is powerful because it can establish a connection between a person and a crime scene that other forms of evidence may never reveal. In Turner's case, it provided a direct link between him and victims whose murders had remained mysteries for years. However, prosecutors did not rely on DNA alone. They also presented the broader circumstances surrounding the murders. The victims shared certain characteristics. Many were women living in vulnerable situations, including homelessness, addiction, or involvement in prostitution. The crimes occurred within the same general area of South Los Angeles. Several victims had suffered sexual assaults before being strangled. Their bodies were abandoned in outdoor locations such as vacant areas and alleys. These similarities supported the argument that the murders were not isolated incidents but part of a larger pattern carried out by the same offender. The prosecution's presentation focused on the victims themselves and the evidence that connected their cases. The goal was not to portray Turner as a mysterious or extraordinary criminal figure, but to demonstrate a factual chain of events supported by scientific proof. Each victim represented an individual homicide investigation. Each case contained its own evidence. Together, those cases formed a picture of a repeated pattern that had continued for more than a decade. Among the cases presented was the murder of Regina Washington, whose death remained one of the most emotionally significant crimes connected to Turner. Washington was approximately 6 to 7 months pregnant when she was killed. The evidence showed that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Prosecutors argued that Turner was responsible for both her death and the death of her unborn child. The circumstances of the case highlighted the devastating impact of Turner's actions and became an important part of the prosecution's presentation. The trial also revealed the importance of cold case investigations. Many of the victims had died years before Turner was identified. Their cases had remained unresolved despite the efforts of investigators who worked with the resources available at the time. The prosecution demonstrated how technological advances could revisit old evidence and provide answers that were impossible to obtain during the original investigations. The trial therefore represented not only an effort to convict one defendant, but also the culmination of years of investigative persistence. After hearing the evidence, the jury reached its decision. Turner was convicted of 10 murders connected to the first prosecution. The verdict represented a major moment for the victims' families and for investigators who had spent years searching for answers. For many relatives, the conviction provided a sense of justice that had been delayed for far too long. It confirmed that the women whose deaths had once been unsolved had not been forgotten. Their cases had remained active, their evidence had been preserved, and eventually the person responsible had been identified. Following the convictions, Turner was sentenced to death in 2007. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the number of victims involved. However, the investigation did not end with the first trial. Authorities continued examining other homicide cases that had remained unresolved. The success of the DNA investigation raised an important question. Were there additional victims connected to Turner whose cases had not yet been identified? Investigators returned to preserved evidence from older cases, analyzing samples that had previously been impossible to link to a suspect. As forensic technology continued improving, additional connections emerged. The same investigative process that had solved the first group of murders now opened the possibility of solving even more. This continued review demonstrated an important characteristic of modern cold case investigations. A successful identification does not necessarily close every question. Instead, it can create new opportunities to examine related evidence and uncover the full scope of an offender's crimes. In Turner's case, the first trial established that he had committed multiple murders. Further investigation suggested that the number of victims might be higher than originally known. Another significant development emerged from the continuing DNA analysis: the discovery that Turner's crimes had contributed to the wrongful conviction of another man. David Allen Jones had previously been convicted in connection with some murders that were later shown through DNA evidence to have been committed by Turner. The revelation represented one of the most serious consequences of failing to identify the true offender earlier. It demonstrated not only the importance of finding the guilty, but also the importance of protecting innocent people from being punished for crimes they did not commit. DNA evidence became the tool that corrected both sides of the injustice. It identified the person responsible while helping clear someone who had been wrongly convicted. The case of David Allen Jones became a powerful example of why forensic evidence must be evaluated carefully and why convictions must always remain open to review when new scientific information emerges. The Turner investigation therefore carried two different but equally important messages. First, it showed how advances in science can bring long-delayed justice to victims and their families. Second, it showed how the absence of definitive evidence can lead to devastating consequences, including wrongful convictions. As investigators continued reviewing additional cases, prosecutors prepared to pursue further charges against Turner. The evidence already established that he was responsible for a significant number of murders, but authorities believed the full extent of his crimes had not yet been revealed. In the years that followed, additional DNA testing would lead to 4 more murder charges. The investigation that had begun with one cold case breakthrough continued expanding as more evidence was examined. By this point, Chester Turner had become recognized as one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in Los Angeles history. Yet the focus of the investigation remained the victims and the evidence that represented their final moments. The DNA that connected Turner to the murders was not merely a scientific achievement. It was a pathway to answers for families who had lived for years without knowing what happened to their loved ones. The 2007 trial marked a major chapter in the story, but it was not the final one. More questions remained. More evidence waited to be examined. And more victims would eventually be connected to the man who had spent years hiding behind the limitations of an earlier era of criminal investigation. After Chester Dwayne Turner was convicted in 2007 for the first group of murders linked through DNA evidence, investigators continued examining the possibility that his crimes extended beyond the cases presented during the initial trial. The conviction had answered one of the most important questions in the investigation: the identity of the offender. However, it did not necessarily answer the larger question of how many victims had actually fallen prey to Turner during the years he operated in South Los Angeles. For investigators, prosecutors, and the families of victims, the discovery of Turner's identity was not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of a deeper examination into the full scope of his crimes. The same forensic technology that had revealed Turner's involvement in 10 murders now provided an opportunity to revisit additional unsolved cases. Throughout the years before his arrest, law enforcement agencies had accumulated countless homicide files involving women whose deaths shared certain similarities. Some cases had remained separate because there was no scientific evidence available to connect them. Others had been investigated under different assumptions because of the confusion surrounding multiple serial offenders operating in the same area. With Turner identified, detectives could now compare his DNA profile against preserved evidence from older investigations. The process required patience and precision. Investigators could not simply assume that every unsolved murder with similar circumstances was connected to Turner. Each case required scientific confirmation. Evidence had to be examined, laboratory results had to be verified, and prosecutors needed to determine whether the available information could support a criminal charge. The goal was not to increase the number of cases associated with Turner without proof. The goal was to ensure that every victim received a careful and accurate investigation. This continued review eventually led authorities to additional evidence connecting Turner to more murders. In 2011, prosecutors charged Turner with 4 additional killings. These cases represented crimes that had remained unresolved until further DNA analysis connected them to the same offender. The new charges demonstrated the lasting importance of preserved forensic evidence. Years after the victims had died, and long after investigators had exhausted many traditional investigative methods, scientific advances provided the answers that had previously been impossible to obtain. The 4 additional cases expanded the known scope of Turner's crimes and reinforced the prosecution's argument that he had been responsible for a long-running series of murders between 1987 and 1998. The victims connected to these later charges became part of the same tragic pattern identified during the earlier prosecution. They were women whose lives intersected with Turner during a period when many vulnerable individuals in South Los Angeles faced serious risks. Their circumstances varied, but many shared characteristics with the earlier victims. Several struggled with addiction, homelessness, or unstable living conditions. Some were involved in prostitution. These similarities reflected the pattern prosecutors had described during the first trial. Turner repeatedly targeted women who were less likely to receive immediate attention if they disappeared. Again, investigators emphasized that these circumstances did not make the victims responsible for what happened to them. Their vulnerability was something Turner exploited. The responsibility belonged entirely to the person who chose to harm them. The additional prosecutions also reinforced the importance of distinguishing between suspicion and proof. During the years when the murders occurred, investigators had been aware that a serial offender or offenders might be operating in South Los Angeles. However, without DNA evidence, connecting individual crimes to a specific person remained extremely difficult. The Turner investigation showed how dangerous assumptions could be. A pattern might suggest that crimes were related, but only objective evidence could establish the identity of the person responsible. The DNA matches provided that certainty. In 2014, Turner was convicted for the additional 4 murders. The new convictions resulted in another death sentence. By that point, Turner had received 2 separate death sentences for the 14 murders for which he had been convicted. Although California's death penalty system was not actively carrying out executions, the sentences reflected the severity of the crimes and the number of victims involved. The legal outcome established Turner as one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in Los Angeles history. However, the impact of the case extended beyond the convictions themselves. One of the most significant consequences of the investigation was the discovery that another person had suffered because Turner remained unidentified for so long. David Allen Jones had previously been convicted in connection with some murders that DNA evidence later demonstrated were committed by Turner. The revelation represented one of the most painful aspects of the case. When a serial offender remains free, the damage extends beyond the victims and their families. The possibility exists that investigators may pursue the wrong person, especially in cases where evidence is incomplete and public pressure for answers is intense. The Turner case became a clear example of this danger. Jones's wrongful conviction highlighted the importance of reliable forensic evidence and the necessity of reviewing cases when new information emerges. DNA evidence ultimately served 2 purposes. It helped establish Turner's guilt, and it helped demonstrate that Jones was not responsible for crimes he had not committed. His conviction was overturned, and he was released after the new evidence showed the connection to Turner. The situation became a powerful reminder that justice requires both accountability and accuracy. Finding the true offender is essential, but so is protecting innocent people from being punished for someone else's crimes. As Turner's convictions accumulated, authorities continued to examine whether additional murders might be connected to him. Prosecutors believed the 14 confirmed victims might not represent the complete number of people killed by Turner. Estimates suggested that he could have been responsible for 15, 16, or possibly more murders. These additional possibilities reflected the difficulty of investigating crimes committed against highly vulnerable victims. Some disappearances may never have been reported. Some cases may have lacked preserved evidence. Some victims may never have been identified as part of Turner's pattern because no surviving evidence existed to make the connection. The investigation, therefore, remained a reminder that the known number of victims in a serial murder case is sometimes limited not by the offender's actions, but by the available evidence. The case also attracted attention beyond California. The use of DNA to solve a decades-old series of murders demonstrated the growing importance of forensic databases in criminal investigations across the United States. Turner's identification showed how offenders who avoided detection for years could eventually be connected to crimes through biological evidence collected long before their names were known to investigators. It also demonstrated why agencies continue preserving evidence from unsolved cases, even when immediate solutions appear impossible. A crime that cannot be solved today may still be solved years later as technology develops. In June 2024, prosecutors in Utah charged Turner in connection with the 1998 killing of Idisha Camp after DNA was reportedly linked to evidence from that case. At that stage, the matter remained within the legal process and had not resulted in a final court judgment. The development showed that even decades after Turner's California convictions, investigators were still examining possible connections between him and other unsolved crimes. It also reinforced the continuing nature of cold case investigations. The discovery of one offender's identity does not automatically close every question surrounding his criminal history. Each potential connection must still be investigated individually, supported by evidence, and tested through the legal system. Today, Chester Turner remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison. He continues to face his death sentences, although California's current suspension of executions means those sentences have not been carried out. His name remains associated with one of the most significant serial murder investigations in Los Angeles history. But the lasting importance of the case extends beyond the offender himself. The story of Chester Turner is ultimately a story about the victims, the families who waited for answers, the investigators who preserved evidence through years of uncertainty, and the scientists whose work transformed forgotten samples into undeniable proof. It is also a story about the consequences of overlooking vulnerable communities. Many of Turner's victims were women whose struggles made them less visible to society. Their lives were shaped by challenges, but those challenges never reduced their value. The investigation revealed how easily vulnerable people can become targets when a criminal believes their disappearance will not receive immediate attention. The eventual discovery of Turner did not erase the years of suffering caused by his crimes. It could not return the 14 women whose lives were taken or undo the pain experienced by their loved ones. But the convictions provided a measure of accountability, and the DNA evidence ensured that the truth could finally be established. The case stands as one of the clearest examples of how modern forensic science can transform the pursuit of justice. Evidence collected decades earlier, preserved through years of uncertainty, ultimately became the voice of victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The case of Chester Dwayne Turner remains one of the most significant examples of how a serial murder investigation can remain hidden in plain sight for years before science finally reveals the truth. His crimes lasted more than a decade, from 1987 to 1998, during a period when South Los Angeles was already struggling with widespread violence, drug addiction, poverty, and social instability. The passage of time did not erase the crimes, but it created enormous challenges for investigators attempting to identify the person responsible. What eventually solved the case was not a confession, a dramatic witness statement, or a sudden mistake by the offender. Instead, the turning point came from evidence that had been collected years earlier and preserved until forensic technology advanced enough to reveal its meaning. The investigation into Turner's crimes demonstrates both the power of modern DNA analysis and the importance of recognizing the humanity of victims whose circumstances made them especially vulnerable. Throughout the years when Turner operated in South Los Angeles, many of his victims existed on the margins of society. They were women who often struggled with addiction, homelessness, unstable housing, or involvement in prostitution. These circumstances affected how their disappearances were perceived and how quickly their cases received attention. Yet their difficult circumstances never reduced the importance of their lives. Every victim had personal experiences, relationships, and a future that was taken away. The investigation into Turner's crimes eventually brought their names back into public awareness. But for many years their cases remained unresolved. The women were often remembered only through police reports, forensic evidence, and unanswered questions. The eventual identification of Turner allowed investigators to restore some measure of recognition to victims who had waited years for justice. The story of the investigation also reveals the limitations faced by law enforcement during the period when the murders occurred. Detectives investigating the early cases were not ignoring evidence or failing to pursue leads. They were working within the scientific and technological boundaries of their time. Biological evidence was collected, documented, and preserved, but DNA databases and advanced matching techniques had not yet developed to the level necessary to identify an unknown offender. The evidence existed, but the tools required to interpret it were still evolving. This created a situation in which investigators unknowingly possessed the key to solving the crimes, while being unable to use it effectively. The Turner case became a powerful example of why preserving evidence is so important in criminal investigations. Scientific knowledge changes. Techniques improve. A piece of evidence that appears inconclusive at one point in history may become decisive years later. In Turner's case, samples collected from crime scenes in the late 1980s and 1990s remained available until they could eventually be compared with his DNA profile after his 2002 rape conviction. That comparison changed everything. Before the DNA match, Turner was simply another individual with a criminal history living in Los Angeles. After the DNA match, he became connected to multiple unsolved murders through objective scientific evidence. The investigation also revealed how complicated serial murder cases can become when multiple offenders operate in the same environment. During the same period, South Los Angeles experienced several violent crimes involving vulnerable women. Investigators attempted to identify patterns among cases, but they were dealing with a reality more complicated than a single unknown killer. Multiple serial offenders were active, creating overlapping patterns that made investigations far more difficult. The term Southside Slayer was used during that era to describe the unknown offender or offenders responsible for certain crimes in the area. However, later evidence showed that several different individuals were responsible for different groups of murders. This confusion demonstrates why behavioral similarities alone cannot always identify a criminal. Different offenders can commit crimes in similar ways, especially when they target similar victims in similar environments. The breakthrough came only when forensic evidence provided something far stronger than patterns or assumptions: a direct biological connection. The legal proceedings that followed demonstrated the importance of combining scientific evidence with careful prosecution. In 2007, Turner was convicted for 10 murders. Prosecutors presented DNA evidence recovered from victims and crime scenes, along with expert testimony explaining the significance of those findings. The case did not depend on a single piece of evidence, but on the accumulation of scientific connections, investigative findings, and consistent patterns across multiple crimes. The convictions provided long-awaited answers for families who had spent years without knowing who was responsible. However, the legal process continued after the first trial. Further DNA analysis led investigators to additional cases connected to Turner. In 2014, he was convicted of 4 more murders and received another death sentence. The expansion of the case showed that the full extent of a serial offender's crimes may not always be known immediately. Investigations can continue long after an initial conviction, especially when preserved evidence from older cases remains available for examination. The Turner case also became significant because of the way DNA evidence corrected a serious injustice involving another person. David Allen Jones had previously been convicted in connection with murders that DNA evidence later showed were committed by Turner. His release after the discovery of new evidence demonstrated that forensic science does more than identify criminals. It can also protect innocent people and reveal when previous conclusions were incorrect. This aspect of the case is one of its most important lessons. Justice is not only about finding someone to punish. It is about finding the truth. The wrongful conviction of Jones showed the devastating consequences that can occur when the true offender remains unidentified. It also demonstrated why continued review of criminal cases is essential when new evidence emerges. One of the most difficult aspects of studying Turner's crimes is accepting that the 14 confirmed murders may not represent the complete number of victims. Prosecutors have suggested that Turner could have been responsible for additional killings, possibly 15, 16, or more. However, criminal investigations require evidence, and not every suspected connection can be proven in court. Some victims may remain unidentified. Some cases may lack preserved biological evidence. Some disappearances may never have been recognized as connected to a homicide investigation. This uncertainty is one of the most painful realities of serial murder cases. The known victims represent only the cases where investigators were able to establish responsibility through available evidence. The possibility of additional victims serves as a reminder that the true impact of a serial offender may extend beyond the official number of convictions. In 2024, Turner's name appeared again in connection with a case outside California when Utah prosecutors charged him in the killing of Idisha Camp from 1998 after DNA evidence was reportedly linked to the investigation. At that stage, the case remained unresolved within the legal process, and no final judgment had been reached. The development demonstrated that investigations involving serial offenders can continue decades after the original crimes. Even after convictions, authorities may continue examining evidence, searching for answers, and attempting to identify whether additional victims were connected to the same offender. Today, Chester Turner remains incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to serve his death sentences. California's current suspension of executions means those sentences have not been carried out. His case remains part of the broader history of American serial murder investigations, particularly because of the role DNA technology played in identifying him. Yet focusing only on Turner risks overlooking the people whose lives were taken. The most important part of this story is not the offender's identity, but the victims who deserved justice. The women killed between 1987 and 1998 were more than statistics in a criminal case. They were individuals whose lives ended because of another person's actions. The investigation eventually gave their families answers, but it could not restore what had been lost. The lasting lesson of the Chester Turner case is therefore not simply that technology can solve old crimes. It is that every victim matters, even when society fails to see their struggles. Their circumstances should never determine the value placed on their lives or the urgency given to finding the truth. The evidence that finally identified Turner had been waiting for years, but behind every piece of forensic material was a person whose story deserved to be heard. The case stands as a reminder that justice requires persistence, science, accountability, and above all, recognition of the humanity of those who were harmed. The victims' names, not the killers, should remain at the center of the story. Their lives were the reason the investigation mattered, and their memory is the reason the search for truth continued for so many years.